Namaste, I'm Diksha Yadav, your host for What This Means, a Swarajya podcast show where we discuss news behind the news. Joining us for the first time in this episode is Karan Bhasin. He's a lecturer and a researcher at University of Albany, New York. Hi Karan, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much. Nice to be on the podcast.
Karan, just for the viewers, the latest study by Karan, along with Dr. Surjit Bhalla, which is on 4 facts on inclusive growth in India, has shown that India has not only eliminated the extreme poverty, but also that poverty and inequality has also declined in the past decade. In this episode, we'll talk all about the inclusive growth and poverty situation right now in India. And yeah, Karan, when I ended reading your paper and a few articles also related to that, the first thing that came to my mind is the middle class or lower middle class, the new poor. So I'll take that question in the end. Actually, we'll end with that, starting with the research there. You begin with that four beliefs that you were wanting to address, and I think not just those four, you have addressed more than those four beliefs. So can we start, like, let's start with that. What are those four beliefs that you wanted to address, and then we can go take one by one.
So, uh, the issue of measurement of poverty in India has been kind of an ongoing debate, largely started with the non release of the 2017-18 data.
Mm-hmm.
And once the decision to not release that survey was undertaken, you had this kind of discussion about where India's poverty is
Yeah.
relative to where it was in 2011, and that basically led to a kind of divergence of views or other disagreement among experts, because some thought that it has reduced and some thought that it has increased. Now, fast forward to 2022, which of course is 3 years after 2019.
Yeah.
Two papers came out sometime in spring, basically March, April, actually, within a week. One of them was authored by me, Dr. Surjit Bhalla, and Dr. Arvind Vermani, which talked about India's experience of poverty and inequality during the pandemic, and what fiscal transfers did per se to these measures. And then the other paper that came out was from Sutirtho Roy and Van der Wheat, who were basically the guys at World Bank who kind of use CMI data, and that really started a formal debate on where poverty was in India, because
Mm-hmm.
essentially we had two very different estimates. And the reason we had two very different estimates was not just because we were using different methods, but also because we were comparing it with two very different surveys from 2011, because
Mm-hmm.
NSS typically did type 1 and type 2 surveys, and Indian government essentially prefers type 2. So we were using type 2, whereas they were using type 1. Now, there was no real way of knowing what the actual estimate is up until last year, when the government finally did release the 2022-23 survey, which was the first survey
Mm-hmm.
released after 2011-12.
Right.
And at that point, basically, we had a follow up paper where we did find that indeed extreme poverty was at 2%, which is what we had in our 2022 paper. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
so that basically kind of settled the issue of how to predict poverty in the absence of survey. So that's what we did last year.
So.
This
Mm-hmm.
year, when we had the new survey also released sometime a couple of weeks ago, that's
Mm-hmm.
when we really got into this, trying to use different poverty lines and see um how inclusive growth has kind of to some extent helped alleviate poverty, and to a greater extent what has happened to inequality in India. And at that point, basically, we kind of used a bunch of poverty lines and address four persistent beliefs that somehow does not go
Yeah.
away.
Mm-hmm.
And that was the focus of this paper. So this is kind of like a very long background into how we actually got here, and why this belief essentially is something that needs to be challenged, or at least set the record straight using
Yeah.
official data.
When you talk about this poverty, what is, like, for our viewers, what is actually the international standard who are considered to be, in that extreme poverty line or poor household? What is exactly? that in considering the international definition, and also what India uh, has for itself.
So it's kind of interesting because the international definition by the bank is typically derived using the 15 poorest countries. That has been the standard practice. And that's how
Hmm.
the dollar a day poverty line also kind of came into existence. It used to be a dollar a day. So if you earned
Okay.
less than a dollar a day in PPP, you were defined as poor, and then that became 1.9 and then became
Hmm.
2.15. And
Yeah.
that was very close to Tendulkar poverty line because, India was amongst the 15 poorest countries historically. uh,
Hmm.
so that used to be the benchmark that we used to use, and that benchmark was, I think, in some sense worked well for a major part of its existence. But where we kind of think that it stopped working well for India is actually
Hmm.
2011. And a lot of your viewers might be able to recall that in 2011, when the HCES 2011-12 survey was released, and then in 2000, I think 13, you had the famous press conference by Planning Commission where they kind of gave the Tendulkar poverty lines of 32 rupees, less than 32 rupees in urban areas, and 27 rupees in rural areas,
Yeah.
and that created a big
Hmm.
controversy because people said that, look, we are going to give you 32 rupees in an urban area, and you try to live
Yeah.
on that 32 rupees, and then then we'll talk whether this is an adequate poverty line or not.
Right.
So even in 2011, this poverty line called Tendulkar poverty line was very questionable. uh, but unfortunately, that's the official poverty line that has existed. And
Hmm.
similarly, the World Bank has a bunch of poverty lines, and you can kind of try to use whichever poverty line you want to use, higher or lower. And in our paper, we use a bunch of poverty lines, and what we find is that no matter what poverty line you use, actually there has been a very sharp decline in poverty levels in
Poverty.
India, and
Hmm.
near elimination of extreme poverty. So there's that, at least that part of the story is quite robust to the choice of poverty line.
So, like, if you can tell what has been the trend in India, like how much, I think it was over 50% when in our 90s time, or like when this
Yeah, so
poverty was
so so
introduced.
so in this paper, the at least the present version of the paper, we don't go beyond 2004. And the
Hmm.
reason is that, going beyond 2000, in fact, we don't even compare 2004 with what we have now, since those
Right.
are like two very different ways of estimating consumption. Just to give viewers some context, essentially what used to happen was, earlier NSS surveyors would go to a household and ask you, how much money did you spend over the last 30 days?
Yeah.
And people would not remember how much salt, onion, and perishable items they purchased over the last 30 days, and
Yeah.
that led to a
Yes.
problem. So, to correct that, they decided to kind of ask questions on at least perishable items for 7 days and some
Hmm.
items for 365 days, so things that you would not buy every month, durables and,
Hmm.
like, stuff like that. And we don't have a seventh, 30 and 365 definition going back. That's something that we're working on right now. And
Hmm.
we're revising this paper to kind of include even that comparison. But what we have put out right now basically tells us that in 2011, if you take the higher poverty line, the World Bank 3.2 or 3.65, you are close to 50% people above, below the poverty line. And now that
Hmm.
number has come down to 15%, which again is quite remarkable if you think about it. If you look at extreme poverty figures, it used to be around 12-13% in 2011, and that has also come down to, less than 1%. uh,
Hmm.
and then we have a bunch of relative poverty lines, which basically is derived from how Europe essentially measures poverty. And what you
Hmm.
find over there is, again, the same thing plays out over there too. You see a very sharp decline in poverty. So what actually has happened over the last decade is that, in some sense, the bottom three deciles, the bottom 30% or 40% of the
Hmm.
population, has
Yeah.
received so much of fiscal support that they
Hmm.
seem to be doing much better than they were doing historically.
Right.
And because they're doing much better historically, that they've kind of, come above poverty. And I think that's the reason why we need to really sit back and think what it needs to be poor in India as of 2025, because it's a very different question than what it was in 2011.
Hmm.
In 2011, one third, less than one, more than one third of the country did not have
Right. So,
electricity and
how
stuff. So
much of it would be contributing to the various government schemes, that the center or the state government runs, like say on food and other things? Does that come into, because they are not paying for that, right, in the consumption expenditure? So, uh,
well, yeah, that was the original point of the working paper at that we did in 2022. But the last two papers
mm-hmm,
that we have done, we haven't actually tried to include that
mm-hmm,
effect. So what you see over here is just the effect of increase in consumption. Now, some of it is because they're getting some form of support in some way or the other.
mm-hmm,
And that's an interesting empirical question that we are kind of looking at, because there are two
mm-hmm,
stories here. First is what has actually happened, and the
right,
second is how it has happened. So this
mm-hmm,
paper is restricted to only explaining what has happened
has happened, right,
and
right.
not why. The why is something that we are still working on figuring out, because there's a lot of interesting things that have happened. So, for
Mm-hmm.
example, this is the first time India has a survey in two successive years.
Yeah.
So
But
we've never had that.
the critics have this problem that it's coming after 10 years. So they didn't release the cycle is 5 years, right? The
Yeah.
main criticism that the other side does not take this data into account is
Well, yeah,
saying,
but see, the thing is that because it's happening in successive years, it allows us to do something which we couldn't have done in the previous survey. So I'll give you an
yeah,
example. And
yeah.
again, this is something that we're working on. So I probably should not throw it out there, but just
Mm-hmm.
we've had so many new policies that were implemented in some states between
Right.
last year and this year
Mm-hmm.
for welfare measures. So what we can now
Yes.
do is actually see how much effect that has actually made towards poverty
Mm-hmm.
and inequality reduction, right? So some of those
Yeah.
policy evaluation becomes much easier now using just this survey
Mm-hmm.
for policies that were implemented in between these 2 years.
Mm.
And I think that will give us a more meaningful answer so as to which of these policies could have really made a big effect on reducing
Mm-hmm.
poverty. So you
Right.
cannot do that in 5 years, but you can clearly do that if you get it in quick succession.
Another interesting trend that it India defies, is what you mentioned in your paper, is that what we see with other countries, or the general trend is when poverty is decreasing, and then we see a major chunk of people changing jobs to say manufacturing, services, and everything. But that is not the case with India. 40% people still are very much in the agriculture sector. So. Uh, Tell us about that. How, what would have led to this, or, what were your
So,
observations?
so I'm myself very surprised, and that raises a lot of interesting questions in our mind as well, because
Mm-hmm.
you cannot, this is the first time that something like this has happened. So it's obviously an interesting dynamic. One possible explanation that I have comes from a slightly
Mm-hmm.
different paper that I did on India's labor market, where we found that at least over the last decade, you've had more and more agricultural workers move away from cultivation of your staples towards cash crops. So
Right.
now you have
Mm-hmm.
more and more farmers engaged in, like exotic fruits and vegetables and cash crops, etc. So I think
Mm-hmm.
because of that effect, because of that shift,
Yeah.
there is a significant kind of advantage in incomes, and that could be explaining this. Now,
Mm-hmm.
that by no means is saying that you can continue to reduce poverty without industrialization. It means at
Mm-hmm.
very low levels of per capita income, at very low poverty lines, you can reduce it simply by shifting within agriculture. But let's
Yeah.
say I want to impose, say, for example, the poverty line that's kind of more applicable to uh, higher middle income countries. Right now, we are a lower middle income country, so this is fine. But let's say that
Mm-hmm.
we become a high middle income country in the next couple of decades, and therefore we want to shift our poverty lines. That's where
Mm-hmm.
I think it would become more challenging
Hmm.
to
The
reduce poverty.
perception shift has already happened, I think, because we see so many, well-to-do people and in good jobs, even many techies, leaving their job and going towards agriculture and farming and things like that. So I mean, the perception that it's profitable and it's needed is uh, there
Right.
within the Indian population. Yeah. So I want to also understand that why did you feel that the one of the first beliefs that you were addressing is the data comparability? uh, why is that? Why did
So,
you?
Some people say that because now you are doing three visits instead of one visit to the household, it's not
Hmm.
comparable. So basically, what happened between 2011 and 2022, and there's again a very long
Yeah,
history
yeah. So in
to this
short,
debate.
you the we are trying to improve the data, right? I mean,
Yeah,
going
basically,
three
long
times
story
like
short,
you.
yeah, essentially, you're asking the same question to the households, but instead of doing a 4 hour survey, now you're doing it like three surveys for 1 hour, 20 minutes, or something like that. So, what happens if I
Hmm.
kind of, come to your house and I ask
Yeah,
you questions for 4 hours? Is after a point, you would be like, I just give me random
yeah,
answers.
yeah, yeah.
To
Yes.
prevent that, basically they did this, and now people are saying that this is not strictly comparable before with surveys before. And
Mm-hmm.
in slightly technical terms, there's no way of establishing whether it's comparable or not, because if there are errors, we would not
Yeah.
know those errors. So the
Yes.
only way to kind of benchmark it is to kind of look at national accounts and see what's
Hmm.
happening on national accounts, and then see if there's a significant measurement improvement in the
Hmm.
survey. And we don't find any significant measurement improvement, and that's
Right.
why we say that there's really no evidence to say that there's significant improvement in the measurement of consumption expenditures by just going from uh, 4 hours to 1 hour visits three times during the year. And
Hmm.
I think that's the right way to go, because you do want to kind of get a more meaningful measure. You're not interested in keeping
Yeah.
the measure static just because of comparability reasons.
True.
So
How do we keep on improving? I mean, we are already we see that that kind of leads to wrong data, and we keep on depending on the wrong stuff. So, has the government decided to release it every year, or this was
no, this was
just
an
by
exceptional
chance?
circumstance. So the only reason they
Okay.
did two surveys was largely because we didn't have one, and then they want. So this survey is quite important for economic data. Actually, this is
Mm-hmm.
used to prepare the CPI inflation. This is used to prepare certain weights and ratios of consumption in national accounts, and so on and so forth. And that, of course, also affects the deflator. Now you're doing a survey after 10 years, so
Yeah.
naturally you don't know what you would get. So you be very cautious. You take two surveys, and then on the basis of those, you decide which one you want to use for making some of these changes. So
Hmm.
our
Hmm.
for example, our CPI inflation is actually a decade old,
Yeah.
which
Okay.
basically means that we have no real time sense of what's actually going on, because the inflation measure that we are measuring is capturing a
Yeah.
consumption basket for India of 2011, not India of 2025.
Okay. Interesting. So the consumption inflation that we see released every month, that's based on. Uh,
2011, 2011-12 basket, reference basket.
okay. Right. So this was much needed. But don't you think like this thing should this important this data, since it's very important, should be done like every year rather than the 5 year
Well,
gap?
it's very expensive to do it every year. Some countries do it,
Hmm.
like for example, US does it every year, but of course they have a lot more resources to
Hmm.
expend,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Yeah. Yeah.
most countries would do it once in 5 years or once in 3 years. I think either would be fine. I would prefer more frequency. Once in three
Hmm.
years would be better. But again, that's a call that statistical authorities would have to take, because
Yeah.
how often do you actually want to do it
Hmm.
is something that is pretty much a policy decision. I
Hmm.
would also at the same time expect an income distribution survey to supplement this, because
Yes.
we use poverty, we use consumption poverty, we use consumption inequality, right? And then that
Yeah.
leaves space open for people to come up with their own income measures of income inequality, where we
Yeah.
don't really know, because it's not coming from a nationally representative survey. And then
Yes.
it just confuses the reader, because everyone believes inequality is going up, uh,
Hmm.
and maybe it is, maybe it isn't, but how would we know unless we have an income distribution survey? What we know is
True.
consumption inequality is declining, and that itself is pretty interesting.
Yeah, so I mean, this is the most interesting part. The inequality, uh, the consumption inequality is decreasing. So tell us that, because I mean, still people are still writing about how the inequality is widening, and again this trend that you mentioned, we see that the Trend is that when there's growth, and especially if it's not consistent growth, then inequality actually increases. So what did you find in this consumption inequality, and what has been this trend in India, let's say in the last decade?
So, so when people talk about inequality, it's kind of important to see that there are three different kinds that you can talk about.
Hmm. Yeah.
Talk about consumption inequality, which is what we talk about. You can talk about
Hmm.
income inequality, which means how much income you get relative to rich and poor, and
Yeah.
uh, then you have wealth inequality, which is really a store of how much wealth you have.
Yeah.
And the discussion on inequality in India confuses all three. So that's the
Yes.
first problem. uh, Consumption inequality, we find this from survey, so we know what has happened. Clearly, we are at that point where the rich cannot consume much more than what they're already consuming. I mean,
Right.
just because your income goes up does not mean you're suddenly going to start eating more food,
More. Yeah. Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
You may want more services that you may demand, and if you demand more services, that leads to somebody else's income. So
Hmm.
broadly, consumption inequality typically, would at some point stop worsening to some extent. Uh, there's this problem in this survey that really we don't get the top rich billionaires because they're not going to entertain an NSS officer for 3 visits to answer their questions. They're too busy to do that.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
So what we have here is, say, for example, the top 90% of the population and the
Mm-hmm.
poorest. So we're really looking at that segment, and we find that for those it has declined. We really don't, need to kind of contest that, because we find that even from labor income information that's available from PLFS surveys,
Mm-hmm.
and then there's CMI, which again a bunch of authors who had a working paper in NBER, they also found that yes, indeed, inequality has been declining in India since 2017. Income, as I said, we don't have a survey, so we don't know what's happening there. Unless we
Yes.
have a survey, we cannot do it. I mean,
Hmm.
there are synthetic estimates that people have, but then if you look at tax database, even that shows that maybe even income inequality is not really increasing. It's not getting any worse than what it used to be before.
Hmm.
Wealth is more tricky, because that's where I think people have their own different estimates and their own different assumptions to arrive at those estimates. And uh, I guess, if you do have income and consumption inequality declining, at some point it would affect wealth inequality too. So the only question is, whether you want to focus too much on wealth inequality right now, or whether you want to address income distribution and consumption distributions right now, and proceed from that angle.
Hmm.
And I think uh, working more on like making sure that consumption and inequality in income is kind of reduced to some extent uh, may not be a very bad approach towards dealing with wealth inequality, because typically the less unequal a country is, the less its growth spell lasts. So we do want a
Hmm.
sustained growth spell, so we want to kind of keep it under check. um, and I guess well functioning labor markets will help do that.
So, do like other data, like private, consumption expenditure that comes out, and the national that consumption on from the national accounts that you mentioned, do all these the trends, do they match in all of these data, consumption data? I was reading one article on Business Line, and for them, their point being why they think this inequality is widening is because they took the this data from consumption on from national accounts, and what they mention is they category wise, when they saw the expenditure, uh, the total year, like it's from the last 10, like 2014-15 to 2022-2023, they had taken the trend, and the chart shows that the total growth has been good, like 5.13% per year. But what they are saying is on food, food also 4.8, but it's very less spent on housing, water and electricity, which was around 2.6, and even lesser on, say, clothes and food, which was 1.75. So they are saying that, looking at how less is being spent on electricity, housing, and the clothes and things like that, so that means that they are not the
Well, I mean,
inequality is
the
widening
the
according to
first
them.
the first problem with that analysis is that it's using national accounts, with a base year that's too old, uses 2011-12 weights. So
Hmm.
really, you cannot really, look at that and form any meaningful sense of what's
Right.
happening. The only way you
Hmm.
can do it is actually through looking at the survey to see what's going on. And
Okay.
I have become very, very circumspect, in some sense, suspicious of
Hmm.
headline numbers over the last couple of years. Not because there's something going wrong, but because
Mm-hmm.
a base year revision is like long overdue. And when a
Right.
base year revision is long overdue, you have too much of noise in the data. So, for example,
Hmm.
I think our measure of deflator is very problematic. So when you go from nominal to real GDP,
Hmm.
you make very large errors because again your CPI weights are so old. So
True. Yeah.
all
Yeah.
those things also affect your PFC breakup into housing and all of those sectors, because those
Yeah.
those breakup again also kind of depend on how national accounts are constructed, and these data are kind of important for that purpose as well, and how deflators are constructed. uh, Having said that, look, electricity, how many states gave free electricity in
Yeah.
the
I
last
mean,
couple of
that's the question. Where do you put freebies and subsidies into all
so
of this? You know?
so in some sense that's the key problem, right? In fact, when we talked
Hmm.
about this in the 2022 paper, we said, like, if you do give in kind transfers, you
Hmm.
need to account for the value of that transfer to see how much a household is consuming, because we really don't
Yeah.
care about how much money they're spending, we care about how much they're actually consuming.
Consuming. True. Yeah. And
So
it's strange because, yeah, like you say, how whether it's household, there are household schemes, there is electricity, so many states are providing free electricity and all. So how do you really put all of this, right? And almost to my final question, Karan, and that's the thing that I told about the middle class being the, or the lower middle class being the new poor, because the data, like what I just said, or what you have mentioned, the bottom three decile, the bottom 30% of the people, they in your table also it showed that their year on year, just the 2022, 2023, and 2023, 2024 data, uh, it showed that for them it increased around 11.9%, right? The percentage change in the consumption of food and other household durables. But for the other 4 to 9, it was very less compared to that. I think 4 or less than that.
yeah, something
So,
quite
yeah.
big
So
difference.
so it shows that, like in during the budget, everybody starts with this crying. I mean, this not happen this time, but middle class is generally like, for poor you're giving all the subsidies and freebies, and for the rich you have, interest free loans or things like that. But it's the middle class or the lower middle class which is suffering. So do you see that there has to be focus on what's happening to the middle class, and how do we define this middle class, the lower middle class, the
I
middle class?
The thing is, I have had this concern even when the 2022-23 survey was being done, that
Mm-hmm.
you had a major income shock in 2020 and 2021 with the form of
Hmm.
lockdowns. So there was a possibility that in 2022-23 households' balance sheets were still weak. Now, if you have spent, say, for example, money from your savings, first thing you would do is build those buffers up, even when the
Yes.
economy normalizes. So, my
Yes.
suspicion was that this effect might be actually more pronounced for the poor rather than for the
Hmm.
rich. And I
Yeah.
suspect that's exactly what would could have happened with the 2022-23 survey. So, in effect, 2022-23 survey reported a lower number of consumption relative to the trend where it would have been pre-pandemic, because people were trying to save more. Now in
Mm-hmm.
2023, once people built those buffers up, they naturally reverted
Right.
back to their trend level of consumption expenditures. So I think
Hmm.
that could also be an explanation for why there's such significant growth in the bottom three deciles. It's certainly something that
Hmm.
is worth examination, and we do hope to examine this very same issue, because we are quite perplexed at how this has happened, um,
Hmm.
and what possible explanation is there to kind of understand this. And as I said, there are two stories here: what has happened and how it has happened.
Yeah.
So this would basically be how it has happened. And right now it's very preliminary for us to kind of offer any explanation for
Mm-hmm.
why. So all we can say is that yes, this is what the survey tells us, and this is what has happened,
Yeah.
and looks like it's quite an interesting period in
Hmm.
India's economic growth.
Yes, there are subjective surveys for this as well, right? For the consumption expenditure in
Not for
advanced economies.
not for consumption. For consumption, expenditures are naturally subjective because they ask you how much you spend and you answer.
Yeah, yeah,
There's a subjective poverty measure. So for example,
yeah.
someone will ask you and come and ask you whether you feel you're poor, and you may be earning $1 million and living in New York, and you may say that
Still,
it's not enough, I'm poor, and that's a subjective measure.
yeah.
And subjective measures also kind of inform you a lot about individuals' own assessment of their financial conditions. So, for
Hmm.
example, if I find myself to be economically vulnerable, I'm less likely to buy something,
Right, right.
like make a big purchase. So
Hmm.
I mean, that's again another interesting use case of some of these subjective surveys.
Yeah. But I was thinking in that line because then most people will say, yeah, we we feel that we are poor.
Well, I mean,
That's the nature of.
there's also stigma associated with it.
Hmm.
So it could be that a lot of people might not say it even though they feel poor, simply uh,
Okay.
because of the stigma associated with it. So I think something like that would really be interesting to do in India, largely because I am curious to see how households would kind of perceive their own economic well-being.
Hmm.
The
Hmm.
only problem with doing something of that sort is that, well, I mean, in some sense, even if you get a subjective measure, you also need an objective measure to compare it to.
Right, right.
So what
True.
you want to do is you want to go to the same household, ask
Hmm.
the same questionnaire, and then towards the end ask, do you feel that you're poor? And then you can kind of see how many people say that they were poor and they were actually poor versus how many people who said they were non-poor and they were poor, and vice versa.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see and whether it comes out, in the same trend like how it happens in other countries. So, what's the trend usually like? Do many people say that they are earning less?
I
Uh,
mean, it's generally mixed. At least from whatever I've looked, you find quite a lot of people who are non-poor who say that they're poor, and vice versa. So,
okay.
because their own definition of, so it's basically like this, right? You have a mental definition of how much money you need to be non-poor, and that
And
will
then you're
always
upgrading your life, and then you're feeling you're
yeah,
poor, so that keeps
yeah,
on going. Right.
increasing, yeah.
Interesting.
Whereas
Yeah.
poverty lines are kind of fixed and cast in stone for a while. So,
Yes. Yes.
so this allows you to kind of see some of those dynamics. And I really
Yeah.
think India's economic statistics have significantly improved. And
Mm-hmm.
this thing of doing two surveys together is like a welcome decision. We are doing labor force surveys more often. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
we're doing consumption surveys, right? Trying to improve stuff, and now we are also doing a revision of the CPI index.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
I'm eager to see what CPI inflation we get for the last decade, because that would be a
Yes.
meaningful exercise. At least in my work, I've recalculated the CPI for most of my stuff, because I really
Hmm.
don't want to use 2011 baskets to measure inflation.
Right.
So it
Right.
would be interesting to see, because I think our GDP levels and growth rates would change quite a bit after the
Hmm.
revision process is underway.
Right. So, lastly, Karan, as we end it, there is one thing that you have mentioned that with this research, you want to bring a closure to the great Indian poverty debate, and want more focus to be put on the policy work and the changes that needs to be made. So, lastly, what do you want to say? One thing is that you're happy with the CPI inflation. Now the basket would change. That's a decade old.
Right.
What are the other things? Because the Niti Aayog thing that you mentioned, that they have not done much in this, topic, and rather more research are coming from outside. So, yeah, what are the changes that you're looking for?
That's a big problem actually, because originally Planning Commission used to do it. They would come up with poverty
Hmm.
estimates, and now they've completely abdicated their responsibility, which is very puzzling, because now you've had two surveys. The first thing they
Yeah.
should do is like form a committee and then see what the new poverty line should really look like for India. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
and in the absence of us doing that, essentially we are flying in the dark. And uh, look, we're giving 80 crore people free food. This is my
Yes.
biggest kind of policy change that I would like to have a conversation about. Rather than feed 80 crore people carbohydrates, empty calories with very little nutritional value, might as well not reduce that to 50 crore people and give them good food, which is a balanced meal to uplift their nutritional intake, and then, or invest in their
Mm.
human capital in the form of better food and better quality of,
Right.
meals that are provided to them.
Mm.
There's a need to kind of relook at the social welfare system that we have.
Mm-hmm.
Why is it that we have a rural unemployment program but not an urban unemployment program? Can we
Yes.
recast these unemployment programs into unemployment insurance, for
Hmm.
instance?
Hmm.
That if you're
Yeah.
unemployed, we'll give you some money for three months, rather than, which is still 90 days, 100 years, exactly what Manrega does, but in a very different form. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
so some of those things would be possible only if we have a new poverty line, and we have only, a new measure of how many people are there poor.
Yeah.
as
Yeah.
a as a as a as a society in 2025, the
Hmm.
question that I'm unable to answer is, what does it mean to be poor in today's India?
Right. Yes. A new definition that you. So what's your ideal line? This thing that you're pushing for. Like you said, it can. There were two things that you said. Either we can go with the World Bank's higher this thing, or a new one, which is
The
maybe
relative one. But see,
3.6.
the problem is that even the World Bank's higher poverty line shows at 15%. So 5 years later,
Yeah. That
again
also again
we are
will say that.
so
Yeah.
we are making so much progress that, we are really a victim of our own progress in some sense, because the economy is moving much faster than our ability to keep up. And
Yes.
that's a good position to be in. I'm not, saying that we are moving too fast, but I'm just trying to understand, why is it that an institution which has this mandate is not
Yeah.
keeping up? They
Yes.
were
They
missing
need
this
to
entire.
catch up.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
after the Rangarajan committee, they were completely missing. And I guess what happened, from an administrative standpoint, is that the moment planning commission was shut and Niti
Hmm.
Aayog was formed, I think the poverty and planning division was closed. So a lot
Okay.
of the manpower which used to do some of this stuff basically went outside
Yes.
of
Mm-hmm.
the government of India setup. And maybe it's a human resource problem, but you do have experts available, within the
Yes.
government, who can do it. So why not, ask people within the government who have been on some of these committees before, and just, ask them to kind of come up with a more meaningful measure. I think the definition of what it needs to be poor today is pretty much a political issue as much it's an economic issue. So, for
True.
example, do you think that not being able to send your children to an English medium school today, and I know it's a very
Hmm.
controversial thing given the language controversy going on right now,
Yeah.
but I think no
Yeah.
one will object to at least an English medium school. Uh,
Yes.
so, would that constitute as a definition of not being poor? So, for
Hmm.
example,
Hmm.
some of those things.
Interesting.
So, those are decisions that have to be taken. I think being able to send your children and put them through college is
Yeah.
a
Yeah.
very progressive way of defining whether you're poor or not.
Interesting, because this will also push government to put more focus on the schools, government schools, which are still in not a pretty good condition,
Right.
no matter what the state. So that is interesting. And this is like when we talk about the middle class always keeps complaining about this, that the private schools fees are rising and public schools standards are still not that
Same even
great.
for health. Same even for health. Look at the
Yes.
rates of even private healthcare facilities. So the question really is that, you cannot really use something like, say, 3,000 rupees a month per capita expenditure anymore
Yeah.
to be the poverty line, because you go to a doctor, one visit,
Yeah.
medicines, test, 3,000 rupees gone.
Yeah. True.
So so let's have a more realistic sense of, what it means to be. And maybe we don't even need to call it poor.
Hmm.
Maybe call it less fortunate. Maybe call it whatever destigmatizes this, set of people, because we don't want a stigma associated with them that, oh, you have a car but you're still poor. No,
Yeah.
you're less fortunate,
Yes.
and because you're
Yes.
less fortunate, you need some support from the government. And
Hmm.
I mean, I would have been happy if instead of capping prices of cinema tickets, we were spending more time talking about important issues of public delivery.
Yeah.
So it's and none of those conversations can happen unless we have a new poverty line. So essentially,
Yes.
all of it goes down to, what does
I
it mean to
think
be poor in 2020?
opposition should pick this up because they'll then again say, okay, we are, like they will have this point to debate on that we have new definition of poverty. Now we want to bring this up. I mean, it's beneficial for opposition if they want to pick this up, and it will be beneficial
Well, I
for
mean, the problem
everyone.
is that even if they pick it up, it's a administrative statistical exercise.
Yeah,
Why it hasn't happened on its own is something that we need to really wonder,
true.
because two surveys have come out, and we really don't know what is the take of the Indian state on what it
Hmm.
means to be poor in 2025. So that's the big question, right? Like, once they even give us what it means to be poor, like, I don't even want a poverty line. Just tell me what, according to you, is the
Yeah,
basic kind of consumption basket, where
true.
if you're able to afford this, you're fine. If not, you're poor, and then I can construct lines and do my own work. But I don't want to
Yeah.
make a value judgment on this, because again, I'm not there. It's very presumptuous for me sitting here to think that, oh, look, if someone cannot send their children to school in an English medium
No. Yeah,
in
yeah, yeah.
West Bengal, or in Odisha, then they're poor. It's too much to kind of do those kinds of things. So you
No,
really
but
want
once we have solved the basic problem of food and the living conditions or the water, electricity, then of course you will move to the second layer and that's how we'll improve, right? So there
yeah.
has to be something.
So,
So
so that's the thing, right? We've solved the food thing, and now we're asking, what all do you want to include in the next layer? And
yeah,
that's a answer that basically they will have to find and provide. I can understand why they're also scared, not
hmm,
scared, but why they're kind of skeptical of doing it, because they have a multi-dimensional poverty index.
yeah,
But that has its own sets of problems, and even that is going to disappear in 5 years, because it's at what, 15% already. So next
yeah,
5 years
yeah.
it will go down. So we will have to get back to this at some point again.
True,
So
true.
long story short, the outrage that happened in 2013 on poverty lines maybe made institutions a bit skeptical of coming out with poverty lines, because no matter
Yeah,
how high you set it up, people will still criticize it. But just
yeah, yeah.
because accidents happen, we don't stop building roads.
True, true. And like you said, India is growing at, exceptional pace. And then these things, policy work also needs to, catch up. Our productivity needs to catch up, and everything is
Right.
interlinked. So, all right, Karan, it was lovely talking to you. So much insights, great
Thank you so
insights.
much.
Thank you so much for your
Pleasure was
time.
enlightenment. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, listeners, for tuning in. If you're listening to this episode on Spotify, do follow and rate the show. I'm your host, Diksha, signing off. Jai Hind, Jai Bharat.